Imagine waking up tomorrow and realizing something deeply unsettling. Not that the world has changed, but that you have never experienced it directly. That everything you have ever seen, believed, reacted to, or called truth has been filtered through something invisible. Something you never questioned. Something you never chose. And something that has been shaping your entire life without your awareness. Now imagine this. Every decision you think you made freely was influenced before the moment you even became aware of the choice. Your fears were installed before you could question them. Your limits were learned before you ever tested them. Your identity was formed before you ever had the chance to define it. And what you call you is mostly a collection of patterns repeating themselves. Not because you are broken, but because you were trained. And the most disturbing part is this. You were never told the training was happening. There were no warnings, no announcements, no moment where life paused and said, from this point forward, your perception will be shaped. It happens silently, gradually, through repetition, through authority, through imitation, through survival. And by the time you became aware enough to question reality, the framework was already built. You were already inside it. This is what we will call the invisible prison. Not a prison made of walls, but a prison made of interpretation. A system that does not control your body directly, but controls how you see everything your body experiences. Because once perception is controlled, choice becomes predictable. And once choice becomes predictable, freedom becomes an illusion that still feels real. The beginning of the construction. No human is born with beliefs. A newborn does not think in categories like success or failure, worthy or unworthy, capable or incapable. There is no inner narrative saying, I am behind in life. I'm not enough. I must become something. There is only experience, raw perception, unfiltered awareness. But this state does not last, because the mind is not designed to remain blank. It is designed to learn, to adapt, to absorb. And so the construction begins. Slowly, naturally, through the environment. A child learns what causes approval, and what causes rejection, what brings attention, and what brings silence, what earns love, and what leads to disappointment. And without realizing it, the child begins to optimize behavior, not for truth, but for survival. Because for the developing mind, belonging is survival. So the first layer of the prison is not fear. It is adaptation. You become what gets you accepted. You avoid what gets you rejected. And over time, this becomes automatic. You no longer think about it. You just become it. The invisible programming. As you grow older, new layers are added. School teaches you what is correct and what is incorrect. Not just in knowledge, but in behavior. Sit still. Don't question too much. Follow instructions. Be evaluated. Be ranked. Be compared. Society reinforces another layer. Success has a definition. Failure has a definition. Normal has a definition. Acceptable has a definition. And slowly, without resistance, the mind begins to accept these definitions as reality itself. Not opinions, not frameworks. Reality. This is where the prison becomes powerful. Because once a belief is experienced as reality, it stops being questioned. A fish does not question water. It only knows water. In the same way, human inside conditioning does not question conditioning. They only know interpretation. The formation of the inner voice. At some point, something else appears. A voice inside the mind. Commenting, judging, comparing, replaying memories, predicting outcomes, rewriting past events, preparing future scenarios. Most people never question this voice because it feels like me. But notice something carefully. You do not choose your thoughts before they appear. They arise. Then you respond to them. Then another thought arises. Then another reaction follows. This creates the illusion of a continuous self directing everything. But what is actually happening is much closer to observation than control. Thought appears. Awareness notices it. Reaction follows. Then identity is assigned afterward. I am anxious. I'm not good enough. I'll always fail. But these are not truths. They are interpretations layered on top of mental activity. And because they repeat often enough, they begin to feel permanent. The prison without walls. At this stage, something subtle happens. The prison is complete, not because you're forced inside it, but because you no longer recognize it as a structure. It becomes normal, familiar, comfortable, even in its discomfort, because the mind prefers known limitation over unknown possibility. Even suffering becomes predictable, and predictability feels like safety. So people stay, not because they cannot leave, but because they do not see they are inside. And that is the most effective prison of all. One that does not prevent movement, but shapes direction. One that does not block decisions, but determines what feels like a possible decision. One that does not remove freedom, but defines what freedom looks like. And if freedom is defined incorrectly, then even escape becomes impossible to imagine. The first question that breaks the pattern. But every system has a weakness, and this one begins to crack with a single realization. Not everything you think is necessarily true. At first, this is uncomfortable because it introduces doubt into something that has always felt stable. But doubt is not the enemy. Doubt is the beginning of perception. The moment you notice, I'm not observing reality directly, but interpreting it through layers I never chose. Something shifts. For the first time, there is distance between you and thought, between you and reaction, between you and identity. And in that distance, the prison becomes visible, not as a physical structure, but as a mental one. And once seen, it can no longer fully control you in the same way. Once the invisible structure becomes slightly visible, something unexpected happens. You would think the next step is freedom, but it is not. The next step is resistance, because the mind does not easily abandon the structure that created its sense of stability for years, sometimes decades. Even when that structure causes suffering, it is still familiar. And familiarity to the mind feels like safety. This is where the prison becomes self-maintaining. Not because it is enforced from outside, but because it is protected from inside. Identity, the deepest layer of the cage. The most powerful part of the prison is not belief. It is identity. Beliefs can be argued with. Opinions can be changed. Information can be updated. But identity feels like truth itself. I am this kind of person. I always react this way. This is just who I am. These statements are rarely questioned because they are not experienced as thoughts. They are experienced as facts. But identity is not a fixed structure. It is a collection of repeated patterns that have become familiar enough to feel permanent. And repetition creates illusion. The illusion of stability. The illusion of continuity. The illusion of me. But if you observe closely, there is nothing solid there. Only memory. Only reinforcement. Only repetition. How identity becomes a cage. Every time you react in a familiar way, identity strengthens. Every time you say, I can't do this, it deepens. Every time you avoid discomfort, it stabilizes the pattern. And every time you confirm your own limitation, even subtly, the structure becomes more rigid. Not because someone is forcing it, but because the mind prefers consistency. Even false consistency feels safer than uncertainty. So a person who repeatedly avoids risk begins to see themselves as not a risk taker. A person who struggles socially begins to say, I am just introverted. A person who fails once begins to expect failure again. And slowly, these temporary states become permanent identities. Not because they are permanent, but because they are rehearsed. The role of fear in maintaining the system. Fear is the guard of the invisible prison. Not loud fear, subtle fear, the kind that whispers instead of screams. The fear of embarrassment, the fear of rejection, the fear of failure, the fear of being seen differently, the fear of stepping outside the known pattern. Fear does not need to stop you completely. It only needs to slightly delay you. Slight hesitation is enough, because hesitation leads to avoidance, and avoidance leads to repetition, and repetition reinforces the same identity. This is how fear maintains the system without force. It simply narrows the range of action until only familiar behavior remains. And within familiar behavior, the prison stays intact. The comfort of limitation. There's a paradox here that most people never notice. Limitation can feel comforting, not because it is good, but because it is known. The unknown, even if it leads to freedom, feels uncertain. And uncertainty activates fear. So the mind makes a silent agreement. I would rather suffer in a predictable way than risk something I cannot control. This is why people stay in cycles they openly dislike. They already know the shape of the cycle. They know how it feels. They know how it ends. But stepping outside, it requires becoming someone they are not yet familiar with. And that unfamiliarity feels like danger. So the prison continues, not because it is strong, but because it is known. Why people defend their own prison. One of the most surprising aspects of human behavior is this. People often defend the very patterns that limit them. They justify them. They rationalize them. They even attach identity to them. Because if the limitation is questioned, then the identity is questioned. And if identity is questioned, the sense of self becomes unstable. So instead of changing the pattern, the mind protects it. It says, this is just how life is. This is how I am. People don't really change. These are not observations. They're defenses, mechanisms to preserve internal consistency. Because inconsistency feels like collapse. But in reality, it is only transition. The illusion of stability. The prison feels stable because it is repeated. But repetition is not stability. It is reinforcement. And anything reinforced long enough feels permanent, even if it is not. Think of it like a path in a forest. The more it is walked, the clearer it becomes. Not because it is the only path, but because it is the most traveled one. Other paths exist, but they are overgrown. Not impossible, just unfamiliar. And the mind always prefers the cleared path, even if it leads nowhere new. The point of no awareness. At the deepest level of the prison, something subtle happens. People stop noticing alternatives, not because alternatives do not exist, but because attention is filtered through habit. You do not consider what you do not perceive as possible, and you do not perceive what you never allow yourself to imagine. So the prison does not just restrict action, it restricts imagination. And once imagination is restricted, reality follows. Because reality is always filtered through perception. The first real weakening of the cage. Despite all this, the system has a vulnerability. It cannot survive full awareness. Not intellectual awareness. Direct awareness. The kind where you notice. This reaction is automatic. This fear appears before I choose. This thought arises without my permission. At first, these observations seem small, but they introduce something powerful. Separation. The beginning of distance between observer and pattern. And where there is distance, there is choice. Even if it is small, even if it is subtle, it is the beginning of movement outside the cage. There comes a moment in the structure of the mind where something subtle changes. Not dramatically, not violently, but quietly, like noticing a sound in the background that was always there but never consciously heard. That moment is the beginning of awakening. Not awakening in the mystical sense people often imagine, but awakening in the most direct sense possible. The realization that you are not fully identical with the patterns running through your mind. For most of your life, thoughts, emotions, reactions, and assumptions appeared as one unified experience called me. But now something shifts. You begin to see layers. A thought appears, then a reaction appears. Then a judgment about that reaction appears. And beneath all of it, there is something that simply notices. Unchanging, quiet, present. The collapse of automatic identity. The invisible prison depends on one critical condition. Automatic identification. The moment every thought is believed, the prison remains intact. But the moment a thought is observed instead of believed, the structure begins to loosen. You notice, I am anxious is not a fact. It is a thought describing a feeling. I always fail is not reality. It is a repeated mental pattern. I cannot change is not truth. It is a conclusion formed from limited experience. And once these distinctions become visible, identity begins to lose its rigidity. Because identity is not something you are born with. It is something you maintain through repetition. And what is maintained can be interrupted. The space between thought and action. As awareness grows, something new becomes available. A space. A small gap between stimulus and response. Between thought and action. Between emotion and behavior. Before, the process was automatic. Thought appears, reaction follows, behavior happens, identity reinforces itself. But now something different becomes possible. Thought appears, awareness notices, response is delayed, choice becomes possible. This space may feel small at first, almost insignificant, but it is everything, because freedom does not appear as total escape at once. It appears as interruption, a break in automation, a moment where the pattern does not complete itself. And in that moment, you're no longer fully inside the prison. You're observing it from the edge. Mental alchemy, the rewriting of inner structure. Ancient traditions spoke about transformation in symbolic language, turning lead into gold, purifying base material into something refined. But psychologically, this reflects something very real. Unconscious patterns are the lead. Conscious awareness is the fire. And transformation happens when awareness is applied consistently to what was previously automatic. You begin to notice fear instead of obeying it. You observe doubt instead of becoming it. You recognize conditioning instead of acting it out. And slowly, the structure of the mind reorganizes itself, not through force, but through attention. Because attention changes structure, what you consistently observe begins to lose its unconscious power. And what you repeatedly bring awareness to begins to transform, rebuilding identity consciously. At some point, the realization emerges. If identity was formed unconsciously, it can be formed consciously. This is where most people misunderstand transformation. They think change means becoming someone else. But in reality, it means becoming aware of how someone was constructed in the first place. You start choosing new interpretations. You begin practicing new responses. You interrupt old loops. Not perfectly, not instantly, but consistently. And over time, something shifts. You're no longer simply reacting as a product of history. You begin participating in your own formation. You stop asking, "Who am I stuck being?" and start asking, "Who am I repeatedly becoming?" Because identity is not static. It is momentum, the disappearance of the prison walls. As this continues, something strange happens. The prison does not explode. It does not collapse dramatically. It simply becomes less convincing. The thoughts that once defined you begin to feel less authoritative. The fears that once dictated decisions begin to feel less absolute. The assumptions that once shaped reality begin to feel less solid. And slowly, the walls that once seemed real start to feel like interpretations, not physical barriers, not unchangeable structures, but patterns of perception. And anything that is perceived can be reperceived, the final realization. Eventually, a deeper realization emerges. The prison was never a physical place. It was never truly outside you. It was a collection of repeated mental patterns mistaken for reality. A system sustained by habit, by belief, by unconscious repetition, and by identification. But once identification breaks, the system loses its authority. You realize that what you called me was always changing, that thoughts were never stable, that emotions were always passing, that identity was always constructed. And beneath all of it, there was only awareness, not trying to escape, not trying to change, just observing, present, unbound. Freedom is not a destination. Freedom is not something you arrive at. It is not a final state. It is not a permanent achievement. It is a way of seeing, a way of noticing, a way of relating to experience without unconscious identification. And because of that, it can be accessed in any moment, not by changing the world first, but by seeing the world without the filters that once controlled perception completely. The prison dissolves not when everything changes, but when you stop mistaking the internal structure for absolute truth. Final ending. So the invisible prison that controls 99% of people is not built from walls. It is built from repetition, from assumption, from identity, from fear, and from unconscious belief. But none of these are fixed. None of them are permanent. None of them define what you are at the deepest level. And the moment you see them clearly, you're already outside of them in awareness. Not because you escaped somewhere else, but because you finally recognize what you were looking through. And in that recognition, the prison loses its final power, because what you are cannot be contained by what you observe. And what observes was never inside the cage to begin with. There is something most people don't expect after a moment of awakening. They imagine it as an ending, as if once you see through the illusion, everything becomes clear, stable, and permanently resolved. But that is not what happens, because the mind does not disappear after being seen. It continues. Old patterns still appear. Old thoughts still arise. Old fears still echo in the background. The difference is not their disappearance. The difference is their authority, the return of old patterns. Even after insight, the mind will still produce the same thoughts it always has. Doubt returns. Fear returns. Old identity structures try to reassemble themselves, not because you are failing, but because repetition has momentum. A lifetime of conditioning does not vanish instantly. It slows down. It weakens. It becomes less convincing, but it still appears. And this is where many people misunderstand the process. They believe awakening means permanent silence of the mind, but it does not. It means you are no longer fully governed by it. The test of awareness. After insight, life begins to test stability, not through external force, but through familiar triggers. A situation appears that once created fear. A comment appears that once created insecurity. A memory appears that once defined identity. And the old system tries to restart automatically. This is the critical moment, because nothing external is forcing you to react. Only habit is, and habit only survives if it is unconsciously obeyed. So the real question becomes, do you return to identification, or do you remain in observation? Not perfectly, not permanently, but repeatedly. And every time awareness wins, even slightly, the structure weakens further. The slow dissolution of the old self. Over time, something subtle happens. The old identity does not disappear violently. It fades. Its reactions become less automatic. Its emotions become less absolute. Its narratives lose intensity. The phrase, "this is just who I am," begins to lose meaning, because you have seen too much of its construction. You have watched too many of its patterns form in real time. And once something is seen being formed, it cannot fully convince you it is fixed. So the old self does not die. It becomes transparent, living between two modes. Eventually, you begin to notice two ways of being. One is automatic, reactive, familiar, built for memory. The other is present, observing, flexible, uncertain, but alive. Most people switch between these modes without noticing. But now you begin to recognize the shift itself. You can feel when you are slipping into identification, and you can feel when you return to awareness. This recognition is not perfection. It is awareness of movement, and that awareness is enough to change the direction of a life. The real meaning of freedom. Freedom is not the absence of conditioning. It is the awareness of conditioning while it operates. It is not becoming someone who never reacts. It is noticing the reaction before it becomes identity. It is not erasing fear. It is no longer being commanded by fear. This is why true freedom feels subtle, almost quiet. Not dramatic, not explosive, just clear. A clarity that was always available, but previously overlooked. The prison that still exists and doesn't. From the outside, nothing may look different. You still live in the same world. You still face the same challenges. You still encounter the same situations. But internally, something fundamental has shifted. The prison is still there in structure, but not in authority. It no longer defines reality. It only appears within awareness. And awareness is no longer inside it. Final closing. So, the invisible prison that controls 99% of people was never truly a place. It was a pattern, a repetition of thought, belief, fear, and identity that became so familiar it was mistaken for truth. And the exit was never a dramatic escape. It was recognition. Recognition that what you thought was you was a process. That what you thought was fixed was movement. That what you thought was reality was interpretation. And that behind all interpretation, there's something that never entered the prison at all. Something that was always already here. Watching, unchanging, uncontained. And in that recognition, the illusion loses its final hold. Not because it disappears, but because it is finally seen for what it is.